Welcome back for part 2 of our 2-part series for React State Management. I'm Mike, and this is Gotta Be Geek, where we talk about tutorials, dev tools, and host tech talks to help you be a better engineer or developer. And in today's video, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the context API and my opinions on it and comparing it between Redux and the context API for state management. So we're going to roll the intro and get right into it. Alright, so to save a little bit of time with some of this, I've gone ahead and already switched this over also to use Parcel.js. So I've made all the same changes I did before in the package.json and the tsconfig, but I do still need to install everything. So you'll see here that there is no Redux stuff. This is all just React because we're using the React context API. So this is all the changes I made to be able to switch over to Parcel, removing all the Webpack stuff, and just having React and to be able to support the same stuff, same things with the tsconfig here. So we're going to go ahead and through and make our changes to the to-do list component first, or to-do item first, just like as we did before, so that we can, actually we're just going to keep that as a string here. And then we're going to do a interface for to-do store. And then the next piece I'll do is I'll go through and make the necessary, actually we're going to make our context piece. So wait, where'd that go? Oh, okay. So I will go ahead and fill out the context file here, and then we'll go over everything that's in it. Moving through this, hopefully pretty quickly. So we pulled in React function component and used state from React, and then the to-do store that we added in over here earlier, and then the to-do interface, and then GUID. And then we've added in the to-do context interface for the to-dos that we're going to track, and again just an add to-do function or a remove to-do function. And then we're creating our context here with just default values, and we'll end up supplying those values here shortly, which is why we don't have anything here, because when we create the provider, then we have to supply actual functions. And because if I were to try and write out what would happen here, there's no way to change this all live, which you'll kind of see as we kind of get through here. So because we still want to be able to track the state, so we do in the to-do provider function component here, we add in the to-dos in a set to-dos function, and then we've done the add to-do function here for adding the to-dos, and a remove to-do function here for removing them. And in this case, I didn't do a map. I think the map was something I decided to do a little bit later on, but pretty much the same here. In this case, I'm just using an object. We could certainly convert this to use a map, or we could do a list, as I'd mentioned earlier before, but I'm just going to keep this how I'd originally planned on doing it for this. And then we're returning our actual UI component here, which is the to-do context.provider, which is part of the React context, supplies a consumer and a provider. And in this case, we're providing the actual state. So in this case, we're supplying value, which is, and then the object, which represents our interface here. And then we're supplying the state that's going to be tracked here. And then the two functions that are going to map the functions that we had here. And then anything that goes inside it. So this will be any kind of child components or whatever is going to be inside this that we want to provide this particular context to, and then we're exporting this default to-do context. Next up is we're going to make the necessary changes that we need to here for our to-do list component to use our context. So right now it's just using what we had before, where we had the store being tracked in the to-do list item or the to-do list component itself. So we'll make the changes necessary here to support the context, and then I'll go over that once I'm done. All right, so I've moved into, or I've switched over to using the context from React here. And then I've pulled in the to-do context, the interface, and the provider that we created from our to-do context file. So, and then in this case, we still have our to-do list function, and we're still tracking our label input and set label function for our state here for the label, or for the input field that we're doing for adding to-dos. And then here we're doing use context for the context that we created. And then similar to what we did with Redux, we still have our own onAdd method where we're calling the context add to do method with the label information and then clearing our label afterwards. And then in this case, because we were using an object instead of map, so I guess it's kind of a good example that we did it this way, so you can see multiple ways of doing it, but I just needed the IDs, so I got all the IDs out of the object using the object keys method, and then iterated those with map to be able to create our to-do list component, or list item component. And you'll see that this is still squiggly green here because we haven't updated our to list item component, which we'll get to here in just a second. The last part that I'll go over here, which you can see isn't in use because I've just added this for a particular concept I'm going to explain a little bit later, but this isn't a required piece. So this to-do list with provider, this is just taking our current to-do list and wrapping it with the provider so that we can just throw this particular to-do list with provider under any other component, and it will just come along with the context and the provider that it already needs. And you can see this is grayed out because I'm not using it. But we will use it here in a moment where I will show what that looks like. And so what we'll do later is I'll end up doing to-do list for the provider and exporting that instead when I go over that particular topic. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and move on to the to-do list item component. And I'm going to make the necessary changes here, and then we'll go over them. All right, so pretty quick and easy on this one. Again, pulled in the context stuff and then use context. And so here we're doing use context to use our to-do context. And we have removed the delete function from our to-do list item props. And we're instead using the remove to-do from our context here to call the delete, and then adding and throwing in our props ID here for the delete. And so that cleans this up a little bit here. And if you can see, we'll go back to to-do list component. And now it's not complaining anymore because before it was expecting that we would add, or that we would supply that delete function for it. And we're not doing that anymore. We're providing that through the context, similar to how Redux would do it. So the way that that's similar is, we talked about earlier how you can have the own props where you're saying you still need to supply these and I'll get whatever I need from elsewhere, right? So this is kind of the same concept where it's still saying, hey, like I still have some props that you need to fill in. And in this case, it's the ID and the label, but I'm going to get my other stuff from elsewhere. And in this case, it's the context where I'm getting my remove to do button. So it's kind of clean and neat that way. That's one of the things I kind of would say I kind of like about the context is it's a little bit cleaner for having that. We don't have to have that extra container file to kind of, in a very verbose way, make that clear that that's what's going on. So before we move on to the extra part that I wanted to show you, I actually do need to go back and change this. So we're going to do to-do list with provider on this one so that we're already wrapping this with our provider. And then we'll get into the other way that we could do this, and I'll talk about why here in a second, but I just wanted to show that we can make this work as is. So pull this browser window open. So you can see we've got our original, and you might recognize this if you watched the previous React tutorial video, then this should look a little familiar to you, but we'll go ahead and add in like test, and then my to-do. And this works the same way as Redux. There's no like real sudden speed difference or anything like that. So it's kind of nice that it all feels fluid and just as fast. And we can delete these as well. So that all works. But the reason that I had these two different ways, which I'll go ahead and change this back now, was because, I mean, this is a clean way of doing this, right? But if you wanted to have a centralized place, right? This is clean for if we're doing just this one thing in a very simple project. But if we start having a similar case where say, again, like we talked about in Redux, where we have a users page where we manage users or something like that for some system. So we have a users context, and maybe we need something from that users context in another part of our application. So doing it this way silos, and it might be nice to do it that way, but doing this silos the to-do provider to only the to-do list and everything else that's under that. And so if we need to have components that share different states, similar to the way we can with Redux, right? Because looking at Redux, we had, and actually, let me see if I can just pull it up. All right, so I've got Redux pulled back up here just so we can kind of see what that looks like, where in the app, nope, where was it? Oh, the store config, sorry. We have the application state, and then the container, we have access to the whole state because everything's meshed into one whole state. I've got like dog hair on my nose. As I said before in other videos, there's always dog hair, and it's like driving me nuts today. You've got the state here, whoops, where every component can access the state in any part from it. So that could be a downside if you didn't want it to work that way. But in the case of this, we can silo off that provider in that state to that particular section of our application. But if you need to share it, then we need a similar way to have this kind of meshed up provider to provide all of the state. So how do we do that, right? How do we do a whole provider or whole state for the whole application? So the way we would do that, well, first thing we'll do is, I wouldn't do this normally, but I'm going to create a about context file here, and I will fill this out with just a basic context for an about page. I wouldn't do this normally for something like an about page because they're pretty simple. There's not really a need to track state and a bunch of functions for an about page. But just for example purposes, we'll create an extra context to kind of make the example a little bit easier to understand. So I'll fill this out, and then we'll come back here in a second to talk about it. All right, so I filled this out with a pretty basic context here. Again, pulling in React function component, created an about context, assuming we just had an about text on our page, and then this about context that we're creating, and then we're doing our provider similar to the way we do with the to-do context and any children under it. And then we're just supplying the default value for the about text that we want, which in this case says just as about page for info from the context API. So now that we have two different contexts, right, the way we want to try and merge those into one place to easily provide that to the whole app, we're just going to make our app provider.tsx, and then I'll fill this out and we'll go over it. Okay, so we've just created a complete app context provider here, which is basically just a place to dump all of the other providers. So in this case, we've done our to-do provider and our about provider. If we had a users provider, we would put that here, and we just get more and more nested providers. And then our application, basically all our application's child components would go here. And then all of these providers would be stacked, and any component within here, right, would be able to use any of those other contexts. So the to-dos list component, for example, could pull in the about context and access what's on there if that were the case. It makes more sense for something like users, right? If we needed to figure out what user was logged in and we wanted to put that on our to-do list component for some weird reason, we'd be able to access that to-do context or that user context inside the to-do component because we're wrapping it everywhere here. And so the last piece is how we would make that work, where we supply that entire context to a whole application. And so the way we would do that is we're going to import our app context provider from our app provider, and then we'll do app context provider, and we're just going to move everything inside there. So Now we're saying everything that you want to put, you have one centralized place where you can put all your different contexts and providers, and then the entire application will get access to it in a similar fashion that you would with Redux, where every connector function from React Redux can access the root application state. So this is kind of how you achieve that similar behavior if it's what you want. If you want to silo things out, like we had talked about before, obviously you can change this to the to-do list. I mean, you don't have to name it to-do list with provider, but you can change it to wrap your component, and then wrap it with your provider, and then similarly, and then obviously you wouldn't need to wrap the whole application with your to-do provider or app context provider. So the cool thing is that you get that flexibility that you can do that if we wanted to. So maybe as an example, say we had that user's provider and that user's context. If we wanted to only supply a few different contexts and providers to the application, but maybe we didn't want to supply the about provider context to the entire application, we could just remove this from here, and we could export the about component with its own provider, kind of how we were doing with to-do list, and then that would just be siloed for that one component. So that's one of the neat things that I do kind of like about the context API. So that's implementing both. We've kind of gone through creating the application with Redux and going over some of what that looks like, and then we've created everything with the context API. So I think the only thing we can go over really now is what the final kind of outcome is, right? So where does that leave us, right? What's the final decision? And that would be that there really isn't one, because it just depends on your needs and how big your project is. If I had to choose how to recommend either the context API or the Redux third-party application for you to use, it would probably just be the size of the project. I would say that if I was doing something really big, like take the GitHub website, for example. So GitHub has a code page, issues, pull requests, actions, projects, wiki, security, insights, and settings. And then they have a few other things I'm sure they probably track as kind of like major sections of the application. But that's a lot of things to track. So while you could certainly do that with the context API, I'm sure they have a lot of asynchronous actions happening. And I think trying to keep all of that a little more organized and separate makes a little bit more sense with Redux, as a personal opinion. It's not that it couldn't be done with the context API, but I would say that I think I'd probably do use the context API in a smaller project and Redux in a larger one. But you could use one or the other for both. So I'm not really going to give a end-all be-all decision of which one is better, because I think that they're situational and super personal preference. But now you can see how they're both done. So follow along, try these both out, and decide for yourself which one you think would be most useful, and then let me know about it in the comments section below. Yes, definitely tell me about it in the comments section below. Which one you've used, if you've tried Redux, if you've used the context API, what you guys think of both of them, and maybe what kind of projects you've used either of them in. If you want to tell me about the project, post it in the comments section below and I'll check it out. And that goes for anybody. If you have a project you want me to check out for some particular reason, post it in the comments section below and I'll take a look at it, and we may host it or talk about it on the channel at some point in the future. So, I think both are great. Context API, as I mentioned, is a really neat addition to React. I think it makes it really easy to get started with managing state in a beginning project, and Redux brings along plenty of its own advantages and a little bit more complexities, as I mentioned earlier. So that's it for me, but as always, it's not it for you, because if you haven't already, please hit that like button so that I know you like these videos and that you want to see more like them in the future. And if you haven't already and you want to hear or see the next videos that come out, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified every time I drop my videos. I will see you guys in the next one.